This is CinePunked. This episode, You Die at Dawn. Hi, I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson, and joining me tonight is the more educated half of CinePunked, Dr. Rachael Kelly.
Hello. Still the one that hasn't seen the Cabinet of Dr Caligari until you actually made me watch it, so, you know.
I mean, there's got to be gaps. I often get criticised for this by one of my parents. He frequently points out that I haven't seen such and such a film, and it's just like, there is a lot of film out there. We all have our areas. Yeah. And
to be fair, there are a lot of films, and they keep making new ones. And I can't even keep up with those ones, let alone 102-year-old films.
102-year-old, yeah. So if you haven't seen this, The Cabinet of Dr Caligari is a 1920s German film, 1920 film, directed by Robert Wiener, and it is about a series of murders committed by a sleepwalker. And I think that is probably the plot in a nutshell. It is a silent movie. So on today's show, unlike some of the other ones you get, if you're listening to this as a podcast, there's no clips. It is impossible for me to adequately do a silent movie clip in the podcast.
We could read intertitles in dramatic voices.
This is the thing. One of the this is only our second silent movie that we've covered on the podcast. The other one being The Kid, Charlie Chaplin's film. But one of the things that I love about silent movies is that, generally speaking, there ain't a lot of reading to do in them. A lot of it is conveyed by the emotions and the expressions, and they are therefore a far more universal film format. This is why I always regard them as the purest form of film. You're not a fan, though, massively of silent movies, are you?
Well, the thing about me, Robert, is that I'm quite lazy. And I learned to watch films with modern sound cinema, and watching silent cinema is a different way of consuming cinema. And that involves me having to put on a different way of watching films. And me being lazy, it requires an effort for me to step out of the normal, comfortable, I'm watching a nice movie mode, and into the, right, okay, I'm watching silent film, which is, it interacts with the viewer in a different way. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are some magnificent silent movies. There are some silent movies that I adore, but I'm still too lazy to watch them very often. You know, I love The Kid. I adore that movie. Have I watched it since we did the podcast? No, I have not.
I mean, it's sort of an interesting space. Like, I was really interested when we did The Kid to find out that Ben really connected with it. I would love to have been available for us to do the pod tonight with him, because, again, I'm intrigued to see what he would make of this kind of film. And particularly because a lot of it is so stylized. I mean, you know, for folks that haven't seen it, there are a few films in the silent era that I think you probably should watch, and The Cabinet of Dr Caligari is one of them, largely because its influence, I feel, is felt through so much of certainly modern cinema, but I would specify things like fantasy and horror.
And film noir.
And film noir.
Yeah.
Although I think Caligari is maybe less of an influence on film noir as it is on horror, for example. But German Expressionism and sort of silent cinema.
Yeah, okay. I might agree to disagree with you on that,
okay.
But you probably have some really sort of in-depth research to back it up, so maybe I won't disagree with you too loudly.
Well, I mean, so let's talk about this. So this is a fairly open-ended conversation about it. We're using Caligari as a starting off point. Now, if you've been listening to the last few podcasts, you'll know that we've been talking about unreliable narrators and about the strange spaces of other worlds and dreamscapes. In our last episode, we specifically talked about Fight Club. And when we were talking about a film that's all about sleep deprivation, it seems that you cannot talk about Fight Club without referencing back to The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, which is also about terrible acts that are committed by somebody who is barely conscious.
Yeah.
Now, for those of you at home, it's probably worthwhile pointing out that both Rachel and I are suffering from chronic sleep deprivation at the moment for different reasons.
We're identifying quite strongly with the characters in the films that we're talking about.
I don't know if this is life imitating art or art, or what's going on here, but I mean, I am suffering from the most chronic insomnia. It is doing my head in, and I am starting to struggle I'm not struggling to sort of discern reality from fantasy at this point. when I'm dreaming, my dreams are certainly more vivid.
What you're saying is you could actually be murdering people and you wouldn't know about it.
I don't think I'd be that bad, because there's always this idea that you couldn't do something that you wouldn't normally do, and I don't think that I'd be that kind of person. I don't think I'm at that stage yet, but I can certainly.
That's a relief. You're not going to blow up any credit card companies.
But I certainly have an appreciation for the fact that things start to change. I mean, sleep deprivation is used as a form of torture, because of the way that it changes the way that you think and the way that you rationalize and the way that you interpret the world. And I've definitely experienced sleep deprivation as a form of domestic torture, and it's not a pleasant experience, which in turns can also be used alongside something like gaslighting as a mechanism for control. And I don't think that's too far removed from what's going on within Caligari and Cesare, or Caesar. Caesar with an E.
I would have Cesare? I pronounced it Cesare.
I just thought it was Cesare. I mean, I've never actually checked the pronunciation of this. Caesar with an E.
Well, if it's in Italy, it's set in northern Italy, the film, isn't it? Oh, no, is it?
No, it's
Where
not.
did I get that from? Oh, the original Caligari was in Italy. He was an Italian mystic.
Okay.
Well, it's an Italian name, and as far as I'm aware, it's pronounced Cesare.
We shall have different ways of pronouncing the name as we go through the rest of the podcast.
Tweet us about it, you know.
Correct us. So
tell me how I'm right and Robert's wrong.
in terms of that, in terms of the so I mean, where do we start with this?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, even that. I mean, it's the unreliable narrator side of it. I think is the most sort of pertinent point here, because even when you talk about, you know, this being a film about sleep deprivation, about what can be the sort of the warping of reality through sleep deprivation, and what can be prevailed upon a person to do when they're under that kind of altered reality. But the frame narrative casts that narrative into doubt. So is Cesare a somnambulist that is under the malign influence of Dr. Caligari, or is he just a harmless sort of inmate, and Francis is the person who's delusional and fantasizing the whole thing?
So spoilerific as per always.
Yeah, sorry, spoiler alert. To be fair, the film is over 100 years old at this point, so
I mean, if you haven't, I don't even think it matters whether or not you know what happens to appreciate the film. Because I'd known about the plot a long time before I ever see it, and I still think it's a wonderful, fascinating work of art. So the framing device, for those of you who haven't seen it, basically opens up in a mental institute, and our protagonist is sitting there telling somebody about his story, and we then flashback, and most of the film is told in a flashback. Although within his telling of the story, there's a flashback within the flashback, to an interpretation of what Caligari is actually about. And then at the end, we come back out of the flashback, back into the institution, and we discover that our storyteller appears to be one of the inmates in the institution, and his spin on people seems to be influenced by the people that he's seen around him. It's a very wholesome wonderland now that I'm thinking about it.
It is a bit, isn't it? But then there's also, you know, that to what extent are we supposed to accept that narrative, and to what extent are we supposed to question whether or not? Because I think the closing, the what do you call that, the iris, on Caligari's face, it demands that we question his integrity. I mean, he looks directly into the camera, and this is the guy that we've spent the past hour with being a homicidal, sort of deranged Caligari fanboy. And we close in on his face, and we hold there, and he looks perfectly benign. He's given every indication in that side of the frame narrative that he is actually caring for poor Francis, who has suffered some kind of psychotic break. But the genre sort of dictates that we then question that.
I mean, I think it's the point at which he puts on his glasses right at the end, because he doesn't have them on. He comes downstairs looking rather immaculate, very prim and proper, and very respectable, unlike the disheveled man that we've been playing about with for the last hour. But then he puts on his glasses right at the very end, and suddenly he becomes Caligari again in that moment. And I assume that he is, in fact, that we've got some sort of replacement of the staff of the hospital, and that Caligari is Caligari all along. So one of the things that
But then there's also sorry to interrupt you, but there's also the question of to what extent was that ever part of the original idea behind the piece, and to what extent do we read that as being antithetical to what we've been asked to give with as the main narrative?
I mean, the framing device was a condition that was forced upon them. It was something that they had to add in at a later stage in production. It wasn't the original plan.
Yeah.
And it does slightly change things, but I think that all it does is add to our level of distrust.
Yeah.
So if you take the frame aside, what you have is a fairly straightforward story of a kind of gaslighting episode and a homicidal maniac. But then when you add the framing, what you've got is the level of doubt, which often accompanies somebody being reported for a crime anyway. Reading one this morning about an incident with a person who I won't name for various reasons. But there's a story going around today, and even reading the comments on that, it feels like the same sort of thing. It's this instant distrust of somebody who's telling their story, even when they present you with evidence. One of the things that's been cited, though, in terms of this is the choice of the German Expressionistic style. I mean, it's all full of artifice. This particular film is sort of a heightened unreality, with very, very peculiar angled sets. It's all shot indoors, on these massive, glorious painted backdrops. And when we open, it's like we're in this very realistic institution yard. And then when he's doing
do we think that?
Well, we do initially.
Even with that, I mean, there's still evidence of the German Expressionist mise en scène within the art. I mean, they still have like the sort of the trees and the abstract shapes, and I mean the closing end of the frame narrative as well. We still got that very expressionistic mise en scène, which I also think it kind of casts doubt on whether or not the frame narrative is to be disbelieved, or where that sits.
It does, and that's what I was going to get onto, because it opens up on that kind of when you first open the film, it does feel quite realistic, because then whenever he does the flashback, that's when everything becomes really, really heightened, and we spend the next hour in heightened unreality. But at the end, when we come back out of that, once he comes out of the garden and he goes back into the asylum, I mean, the asylum is still painted in all these glorious angles and things, so our perception is still skewed, and I think there's still some sort of sense of, I don't know if it's artifice or what, because it, who's telling this story that we're watching, I suppose, is the question that then gets asked.
Exactly, yes. Who is in charge? And I mean, that's kind of expressionism in a nutshell, isn't it? It's that, there is no real sort of objective reality. There is only subjective experience, kind of externalized. So objective reality is not actually a thing. So, you're free to make up your own mind, really. And I don't think the film gives you any really clear sense of what it's nudging you towards.
If it does, it takes it away again very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there is it does sort of exist in this strange space that is heightened reality, heightened unreality, I guess. But also surreality. I mean, this is a film that isn't just expressionist; it's a surrealist film. Partly because it is dealing with dreams and anything that's dealing with that subconscious is therefore is a surrealist manifesto as much as it is an expressionist thing. In terms of the plotting, you weren't very keen on one of the characters. I seem to recall I got messages
Alan?
from you the other night.
Yeah, I was basically live texting Robert on WhatsApp while I was watching the thing, going, "Alan's a dick, isn't he?" "Oh no, Alan, surely not. You were far too young." Score one for Caligari. Yeah, I wasn't fussed on Alan, to be honest. And I kind of understand that he's supposed to stand in for, or we're supposed to understand him as kind of standing in for that kind of romantic, sort of late 19th century romantic ideal to a certain extent. And that's probably why I hated him so much. I was like, "Oh, you're doing a Byron, aren't you?"
I just didn't. I mean, for me, he was such a non-entity. But there's a bit of homoeroticism that seems to be going on around some of those discussions. There's a there's a sequence just before he gets bumped off when you see the two gentlemen sort of talking about him and holding hands, and oh, whatever he decides, and just like there's something going on here. There's definitely a subtext. I mean, Cesare himself, I mean, just for me, feels like a BDSM character.
Yeah. I seem to recall that was part of your texting back. But yeah, I see it. Yeah, it wouldn't have been my immediate read, but you do you.
Well, I mean, like in itself, I mean, the character of the somnambulist, it's definitely a fetishized character.
Yeah.
He's someone who is constrained within the confines of a box, which is like a fetish of its own kind. It's also the skin tight black. I mean, he is the master goth, really, isn't he? And he's the protagonist, the prototype
he's quite emo.
Very, very.
I do like a bit of emo, though. I mean, that look appeals to me. I liked it.
I've met your husband. He's not emo at all.
He's not remotely emo, no, and that is to his strength. But yeah, but there will forever be a part of me that's permanently wedged in the early years of the century.
I mean, on that, it was something that actually just watching it this time that occurred to me that I don't think I'd picked up on before, but has been cited by other people, was the Bowie. One of the people that this character has influenced is David Bowie. I mean, his last video for Lazarus, literally shot a couple months before he dies, includes a character of a somnambulist that is dressed.
I have seen that video, but not for quite some time.
You go back and watch it, even down to the costume. There are stripes across the body that in a way echo the markings that you see in Cesare. He is a somnambulist. I'll post a photograph in the sleeve notes for this on the website. But Bowie's actual production designs for that, specifically refer to this. I mean, it's very, and he comes out of a cupboard. Damn it! I mean, it's as like it as you can get.
Well, I mean, number one, Bowie was incredibly culturally informed and intelligent, so it really was. And number two, this film has been basically like the foundation of so much visual style and visual information and visual storytelling that has flowed. Sleep deprived.
Well, can we talk about that? Because I mean, when I suggested that we cover this one, part of it was because it just felt like a natural extension to the films that we've been discussing on the pod over the last few weeks. But also it's about its importance, and why is it that why are we telling our listeners and our viewers that they should watch this film?
Well, it's the great granddaddy of basically every kind of or not explicitly realist movie that has. Is it too much of a stretch to say every non-explicitly realist movie that has come afterwards? I mean, it has been the foundation, the linchpin that informed how horror developed in Hollywood, via Universal, via Alfred Hitchcock, via film noir. You can see it, and in just about the sort of the chiaroscuro lighting that it employs, the kind of externalization of emotion. You can see this in everything, really. I mean,
I don't know if it's fair to say that entirely about this one film.
Okay. No,
I think about German Expressionism as a whole.
Okay.
I mean, I do think there are very specific influences that have been drawn from this film. But in terms of some of the stuff that you're talking about there, I mean, definitely German Expressionism is a huge influence on film noir and on horror.
Yeah. It's the German Expressionist directors transplanted from Germany after the rise of the Nazi Party, just basically taking the German Expressionist sensibilities. And German Expressionist film and cinema was popular in sort of post World War One America, to the extent that actually the US production companies and distributors were getting a bit annoyed about it because they felt like they were being kind of crowded out of their own market. So it was enormously popular, and so the stylized images. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock was sent off to a German studio at the start of his career to basically learn how to German Expressionist, and he sort of brings that back, and it's everywhere. I mean, you see you see that influence in most of his movies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not the same kind of sort of explicit. I mean, the explicit rejection of realism is something that is that stays with German Expressionism, but what flows out of that visual style begins to be mapped onto more sort of realist. I hate realist, but I'm doing the obnoxious air quotes around realist depictions of horrific events.
Yeah. There is definitely aesthetic qualities that are lifted. I mean, it is, as you said, that very, very stark black and white. It's the black blacks, it's the white whites, it's the interesting angles. Interesting angles, I say. So
You mean a Dutch tilt?
yeah, it's shifting it from theater to film, which is also odd because Caligari feels very stagey.
Yes.
It's incredibly stagey, and the chiaroscuro, which basically what we're talking about there is black and white, stark black and white, big shadows, things like that, is largely painted.
Yeah.
It's very little of it's to do with the actual lighting of the sets. The lighting is there to light up our characters, but it's all about the makeup. It's the heavy eye makeup. It's the heavy black and white of the sets. Everything is very carefully controlled in that way. What ends up happening with some of our films, if we're talking about Fritz Lang movies, if we're looking at Metropolis, we even talk about Nosferatu, which is only a couple of years after this.
Yeah.
When Murnau, we're looking at films that are moving the camera, that are presenting us with real locations and real spaces, and it's the way that they photograph them, but it's still this sort of enhanced, sort of hyper extreme kind of storylines and filmmaking and visual style. I mean, it's one of those things we could talk a lot about the sort of influences we have. For those who watch or listen to our podcast, we have had elements of Caligari has been fed through before. Rachel's probably never, I don't even know if we've noticed, but we have used images from Caligari from our advertising right from the very, very beginning. In terms
I bet I have noticed, I just can't remember.
Yeah, exactly. It's but I mean, it's that aesthetic was something that I thought was quite pointed, but also we talked about Casino Royale.
Yes.
There's a whole sequence in the Berlin training camp where it's all straight lifted out of Caligari.
If you haven't seen that film, it's not the more recent version. What's his name?
It's the 1967.
Totally blanking on his name. Daniel Craig. We go. The Daniel Craig version. Yeah, it's not that one. It's the completely bonkers 1960 one, which is unlike any Bond you have ever seen in your entire life. And you should definitely watch it, but just make sure that you're reasonably sober, because otherwise you will wonder who spiked your drink.
So I mean, like, influence is there. I am drinking out of a Frankenweenie cup. At the moment.
There you go.
I mean, like, Tim Burton stuff is very obviously influenced, and I think visually that's where I find most of the obvious echoes. Something like Beetlejuice with its very stylized, and Nightmare Before Christmas with their very stylized angular sets.
The trees, the tentacle trees, and the sort of the black and whites, the sharp black and whites. Yeah.
Like, it does feel like there's an aesthetic that if you're into an aesthetic, you should probably watch Caligari.
I am into that aesthetic. I'm not massively into German Expressionism, though.
What's the resistance about German Expressionism then?
I think I like it. Right, this is going to make me sound so shallow, but what I like about the German Expressionism is that the very beautifully crafted, every frame a picture style of directing. It will come as no surprise that my favorite director is Ridley Scott. Directors that focus very strongly on making sure every image just looks beautiful, and you could stop it at any point and there would always be something wonderful to look at, and it doesn't matter how many times you watch it, there's always something new and beautiful to look at. I love that, and I love chiaroscuro lighting. I love the dramatic effects that go with it. I get very impatient with films that are weird for the sake of being weird. I'm just like, be normal.
But it's not fair to, I mean, is it fair to say that all German Expressionism is weird for the sake of being weird?
No, it's not. No, that's not at all fair. That's a gross generalization, and it does not apply to most or all of them. But
I mean, I can understand it with this.
But it is kind of its thing. It's not oh, this is where I'm going to trip myself up, because this is not actually true to the way I experience film, but it is true that it's not trying to faithfully represent the world as it sees around it. It's trying to take a slight angle on that world, and I don't necessarily have a huge problem with that. It's just, I think that Caligari just takes that angle and kind of tips it over another 70 degrees.
So so it's almost like it's just too far.
It's just a bit, yeah, it's just a bit sort of, but don't get me wrong, I mean, I was engaged with it. Once Alan died, I thought it really improved.
It does pick up a bit.
It certainly picks up once he was no longer mooning about the place being annoying. But I mean, I didn't wish for him. Oh, I kind of did wish for him to die. Actually, I'm lying. But it's a really interesting. And again, because I knew vaguely what the narrative was about, and I knew that it was about the kind of the externalizing of that subjective experience of insanity. So I did kind of have a sense that Francis was going to turn out to be insane, for want of a better word. But even knowing all of that, it is fascinating to watch that unfold. Yeah, it just, it doesn't really work for me, that completely subjectivizing of reality, obnoxious air quotes.
So, I mean, if you took off the framing that comes on this, if you took off the bits set in the asylum at the beginning and the end, where we kind of work out that he's mental too, apparently, would that have improved, do you think, your appreciation for the film, or would you still be left in the same sort of like, this is too batshit crazy?
Yeah, I'd still be in the same, because I mean, the film is going out of its way to remind you that you're watching artifice. It is going out of its way to remind you that you're watching something that is not trying to represent objective reality. At all times it's doing that, and it's doing that through its acting, it's doing that through its mise en scène, it's doing that through its cinematography, it's doing that through its lighting, which is an aspect of mise en scène, of course. But it's not the story as such. I mean, I think that story, when the story is from memory, when the story was presented to the studio and they agreed to buy it, it wasn't presented as, you should do this as an expressionist piece. That was a production decision that was taken along the lines of down the road as it was being developed. So you could very easily do this as, for straight horror, if there's any such thing. But I don't, I like the story, I like the aesthetics. It's never going to be my favorite movie.
I guess it's interesting to have this conversation with you, because I think it's given me a bit of a better insight into why some of the other films that we talk about, not everything that makes it onto air, some of the stuff that we talk about in private, for instance, that there's things that you're quite resistant to. There are directors that you cannot connect with. And what I'm getting from this is an insight into the things that make you tick. But also that is quite useful for discerning how audiences might feel about it too. Like, this is not one of my favorite films. It's not one of my favorite silent movies. I think it's a fascinating film. I think it's really important. I have fallen asleep during it on multiple occasions, which is, I mean, I think today may have been
lovely
the first
music.
I mean, well, on that particular, the score that on the version that we watched was very effective, but obviously there are lots of scores available. I think today may have been the first time I've been able to get through it all largely awake, despite being sleep deprived. I don't know what it is about it. I find it quite hypnotic. And I find the same thing with Dreyer's The Vampire. It also kind of sends me into a sort of slightly somnambulistic state. There's something about the imagery and about the sort of the dreamlike state almost encourages you to fantasize, I guess, whilst you're watching it. I mean, a cinematic experience should have us engaging with what we're seeing on the screen and sort of buying into it.
But if you're not paying attention and you miss the intertitles, and this isn't often true of silent film, because the acting and the sort of the staging of it is generally geared towards making sure you're able to understand it, and the intertitles are kind of additional to that. But if you're not keeping an eye on the intertitles in this film, you can very easily miss what's going on.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Definitely huge chunks of plot are just
and
gone.
a couple of times I did have to go back and reread the intertitles to make sure that I understood what was happening. Because otherwise it had just, what bonkers tangent has this gone off on now? Why is he in a lunatic asylum? Oh, right, okay, fair enough. But it's, and again, I think that's part of not trying to present something that is realistic. When we understand how that narrative works, when it's kind of a realistic, 3-act structure, X follows what comes before X, which is followed by Y, which is followed by Z. I do know the alphabet. I just can't do it backwards.
You've got a doctorate. I mean,
not in the alphabet, thank you. But so you don't have the same kind of cues, and you don't have the same kind of roadmap with something that is going out of its way to be a little bit nuts. So you need the intertitles to kind of contextualize things. I was confused by the segment after the funeral, which seemed to add precisely bugger all to everything that was going on. It's just like a little sort of, there's an intertitle after the funeral, after Alan's funeral, like, yeah, Alan's dead. After the funeral, then we just see Francis and Jane walking along the street looking miserable. That's literally it.
I don't even remember that, which shows how...
about 15 seconds of them walking along the street looking miserable.
I've totally forgotten that.
Nothing else happens. The funeral is a complete non-event narratively. The walking along the street is a non-event narratively. It contributes nothing to the overall. We already know they're really sad because they've been mugging about it into the camera for a while at this stage. I have no idea why that's there.
I have no answers.
There you go. I have stumped you.
I don't remember the sequence, and I have literally just finished watching the film before doing the pod. So I must have turned away for 15 seconds because it has no recollection at all. I just want to quickly kind of touch on sort of the anti-authority kind of discussions about this, because this is one of the things that's said about this film, and also a lot of the German Expressionist films that are coming up at that point, as well. Is there's a view that says that these are commentaries on German authority, that there's a very famous book and also a documentary called From Caligari to Hitler, which views a lot of this stuff as sort of preempting, sort of foreshadowing the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler's Germany, helped as well by the fact that most of these directors end up buggering off to to Britain and to the US for their own safety, because so many of them are Jews, or so many of them are left-wing thinking, and Hitler wasn't keen on that kind of stuff. And this isn't one of those conversations where we've reduced everything to Hitler. This is an actually relevant point in terms of a discussion.
Godwin's law.
Yeah,
Godwin's law. That's the one.
every internet discussion you have at some point will denigrate it. Will disintegrate into talking about Nazis, whereas actually that's a hugely important part of the cultural context of the time.
It wasn't us that did it. Somebody else did it first. So this has already been Godwin's law.
I mean, it's true though, because he I mean, Weiner left Germany because of the Nazis, because he was outed as a Jew even though he'd been signing up as a Protestant for years. Konrad Veidt, who plays Cesare, left Germany because of the rise of the Nazis. I mean, the people who made this film literally left to save their own lives. Yeah. So we are perfectly appropriate to talk about this. And we're recording this incidentally just a few days after Holocaust Memorial Day, so there's a sort of pertinency and a poignancy to that as well. But do you see that sort of rise of the I mean, how do you feel this is talking about authority? Is this a pro-authoritarian film? Is this an anti-authoritarian film? Where does it actually sit? Because I'm not sure myself.
I can definitely see the anti-authoritarian sort of sentiment all the way through it, and I don't think the framing narrative, I know that the writers objecting to framing narrative had the sense that undid their kind of their anti-authoritarian stance with it, and I can see why they think that, and I think there's a certain argument to be made for that, because the sort of anti-authoritarian narrative is kind of dependent on Francis not being a completely unreliable narrator.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, I don't think Francis is a completely unreliable narrator. And I
No.
think the framing narrative gives enough doubt as to whether or not Caligari is as benign as he's trying to position himself in that I think it is perfectly reasonable to see this film as kind of sort of a cry of rage against, as I mean, by all accounts, Germany got into World War I, um, not quite by accident, but certainly not strategically or deliberately, but due to a set of treaties that it had set up that
Mm-hmm.
were never meant to operate in that way, and everybody just piled on in, and had the most destructive, damaging conflict that the world had ever seen up to that point.
Mm.
And the young men that came back, I mean, I had a relative who was institutionalized for the rest of his life due to shell shock because what they had experienced was just so appallingly awful. And they had been dragged into that
Yeah.
by authorities that had no skin in the game at all. They weren't the ones dying. They weren't the ones being brought back with bits missing. They weren't the ones being brought back so traumatized by what they'd seen that they were never able to function in society again.
Mm.
So yeah, there is that element where, and of course these two guys are both, I mean, pacifists, and the two writers, they're both pacifists. One has served in the war and been horrified by what he saw. Both are actively questioning the authority that dragged Germany into that war, and post-war, post-World War Germany, the Weimar Republic is a mess. It's a mess, and it's the economy is collapsing. Inflation is skyrocketing. People's life savings are being wiped out. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for this film being a sort of what the fuck, guys, what were you doing? And a cry of rage. And I think, you can see the authority figures in Caligari they are obnoxious. They're not to be trusted as such. They're perched up above the common man. They're
Mm-hmm.
accessed via steps. They're elevated. They are not with the common people at all. And ultimately, the events have been manipulated by a madman.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's any issues at all looking at it as an anti-authoritarian film. Where I get a little bit more hang on a second is when that's used to kind of argue that these films predict Nazism. And they say something about the psyche of the German people as a whole, because I think that's a hell of a stretch to make about
Mm.
any film or any cultural product ever.
I guess the thing is when you start looking at a bunch of them and you start seeing these threads that are being repeated, when you look at sort of the concepts, particularly something like control and hypnosis is something that seems to come up again and again as well. I mean, we see the same thing in Nosferatu with the power of that creature that's able to travel and to control people. We see the same thing in Metropolis with the way that Maria is able to control entire workforces, and manipulate people, and the balance between the power of the up aboves and the anarchy of the that exists there, but how manipulation works.
Yeah.
I think when you look at that, you can't help but wonder, is this a reflection of stuff, of conversations that are happening, maybe in private, but they are happening, that there is a sort of unease after the First World War. And Nazism, to be fair, I mean, Hitler's rise to power is pretty quick, and it's not that far off, and it's not possible unless something is happening already that he is tapping into.
Well, it is. I mean, the country is an absolute mess. It's in bits. It has been crippled by the post-war settlement. There's no point in saving money anymore because you can't buy bread. So I mean, I think it's very easy to see Hitler's rise in context there, because he came in and said, actually, this is simple, guys. There's a simple fix here. Let's just sort of scapegoat this entire group of people. It's their fault. It's nothing you did, nothing to worry about here at all. And when people are suffering to that extent, they are desperate to hear that message. So
I wonder, is there a general global feel at the time about class as well, though? Because when you look at what's going on for instance, in Hollywood silent cinema, with the rise, particularly comedy, it was always a really good lens to look at through. A lot of it is about working class people battling against authority figures who really, there's a massive disconnect. Chaplin's really good at it.
yes.
Laurel and Hardy are really good at doing this. Keaton's really good at doing this, so Keaton sometimes feels he's slightly more with it.
Not far off screwball comedy either at this
No.
point as well, which is all about class.
Which is something we will get to at some point during the pods.
Yes, I definitely. Oh, can we do It Happened One Night, please, please, please,
we'll,
please,
we'll, we'll preempt. But I mean, so within global silent cinema, within what's happening at this period, there is stuff there. We tend to focus on particular films and particular directors, and even what D.W. Griffiths is doing. I mean, it's probably worth a discussion at some point. But I just,
if you make me watch that film, you're dead to me.
Not everything we do is comfortable on this. I mean, because
it's
this
3 hours.
But this is also part of what we're trying to do. Is, I mean, we'll watch stuff that maybe we feel we should, stuff that's bona fide classic, stuff that is sort of those sort of anchor points of cinema history. But at the same time, there are things that neither of us wants to go and explore, but every now and then I think it's useful for us to explore things like that. I mean, this, I knew you were slightly resistant, but it's also, you've seen it and you can see its impact.
Oh, I knew. And I mean, when I was watching it, it was almost like being sort of guided along through a room full of images, and oh yeah, I recognize that one. Oh, I recognize that one. Oh, gotcha, I recognize that one. Oh yeah, there's that mise en scène there. So I mean, it's pervasive. You don't need to have seen the film as such to have a really clear sense of its visual importance.
Mm.
However, it is important to have seen the film, and I'm glad you made me.
I'm going to leave it at that, because
you're not getting better than that tonight.
No, I know when to end the conversation. Walk away. So that if you haven't seen it, I thoroughly recommend doing it. You'll find it on YouTube very easily. It's a 100-year-old film, so there's plenty of versions of it out there. Try and get a nice.
Do not get it confused with the sort of quote unquote remakes or the sequels, because those are very, very different.
Yeah, there was, I mean, Vina himself, I ended up trying to do a sound version of this with Jean Cocteau, which I would have loved to have seen.
You would have loved that.
I would have been in my element. I mean, that would have been absolutely glorious.
You'd have got that tattooed on your arm.
It might actually have been the thing that persuaded me to get a tattoo, indeed. And they didn't do that. But then there's a Robert Lippert produced version that gets made in the 1960s, which has very little to do with this at all. There's also a couple of dubious sequels, and there's a slightly porny version of this as well, which I some of you might want to watch. I don't know. I haven't seen it myself. I can't recommend it or not recommend it. And there's a 2005 remake, which I haven't had a chance to watch, because I was finding it hard to get hold of. But apparently it's basically a remake that's done against the backdrops from the original film. So as an exercise, I'd be quite interested to see that. And if I ever do, I'm sure I'll post something up on our website about it. But yeah, so look, go and watch it. Go and check it out. Have a little view of it. If you're into Tim Burton films, I think it's definitely an anchor point that you need to see.
Yeah. I think everything Tim Burton's ever done has been influenced by this film, I think.
So if you're into Tim Burton or The Cure, or you're just like walking around with a face full of mascara, I mean, this is a film that probably should be on your shelves. Should you only ever watch it once, give it a viewing. That's my recommendation for it. So Rachel, thanks very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And if you've enjoyed the film, if you don't enjoy the film, if you have any thoughts at all, just contact us on social media. You'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTubes. You can find this on our podcast, listen back to it again, share, tell your friends, and we will catch you again very, very soon.
Bye.